Alright, welcome to Live, Love, Play. My name is Ross, and joining me today is author Marc Cushman, and together we will be having a brand new series, a retrospective discussion of Lost in Space. Thank you for joining me, Marc.
Thank you for having me.
Alright, so today we are starting things off with the original pilot of Lost in Space, which was titled No Place to Hide, or, as I'd like to call it, the worst family road trip ever.
It could have been a National Lampoon movie. Maybe Chevy Chase should have played John Robinson, right? with all the messes they stepped into.
Oh, no kidding. So for some those of you who have been following my channel, Marc and I had previously talked about Lost in Space in an interview for his biography of a TV series, which you can find in the link above. But Marc, why don't you talk to us a bit about the production, what went into creating this first pilot, both with Irwin Allen's career and previous projects, which eventually led to Lost in Space.
Yeah, to put it in perspective, I mean, this was really key and led to Star Trek getting on the air and a lot of what happened in science fiction after that. And we have to remember that back then, when Irwin was making this pilot in late 1964 and into early 1965, the only science fiction that had been on in prime time in America on the networks was anthology series like Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits and One Step Beyond, which really wasn't science fiction, but we can put it in that category of supernatural and things of that nature. And the reason they stuck with anthology shows is because they were cheaper to make. Some episodes may have been very expensive, but others weren't. They didn't all require optical effects and special effects and people in alien costumes and makeup and things of that nature and spaceships. And the networks didn't believe, and rightfully so, that a series of that type could be made. And so in order to talk about the pilot, we have to step back just a minute and talk about Mr. Allen and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, because that made Lost in Space possible. And Irwin had been producing movies for 20th Century Fox, including the big screen version of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. And then Fox got in, and which were all hits. Everything Irwin did well. He even won an Academy Award for a movie called The Sea Around Us. And he did other science fiction movies like The Lost World, and fantasy adventure movies like 5 Weeks in a Balloon and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. And they did very well, made good money, but 20th Century Fox got into trouble with two big movies right at that time. One was Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, which cost a fortune.
And you can tell by looking at it. After our interview, I went and looked it up and watched it. It is a massive feature, even by today's standards.
It is, and it's not just the scope of it that costs the money, but Elizabeth Taylor had major health issues during that, and they had to shut down production. They had to change directors because the director then had a conflict. So they scrapped a lot of material, started over again, and built these amazing sets and so many extras. There was no CGI back then. It was all real people, real horses, real chariots, real everything. And
Elizabeth Taylor herself.
So it nearly bankrupted the studio. And they also had another movie in production called Something's Gotta Give, and the thing that was going to give was 20th Century Fox. That was starring Marilyn Monroe, and she died during the production of that movie. So they had to scrap all that stuff and recast the movie and start from the beginning again. So those two productions really put the studio in a bad way. They had to sell off a good section of their backlot, which was turned into Century City and so forth, and they shut down all other motion picture productions except for The Sound of Music, which was costing a fortune, and they were still a year or two away from completion and seeing money coming in on that. So Irwin's suddenly not working. And he has his offices on the lot, and he wants to work, so he decides, well, the TV department's still working. We have a few series in production at the studio. I'm going to get into TV. And he goes to ABC and pitches the idea of doing Voyage Beyond the Sea. And they said, Irwin, you can't make a show like this on a TV budget. You can't be doing optical effects each week and having all these models and giant miniatures and so forth. And he said, no, we've already got them. We didn't throw them away. We've got 3 of them from the movie, and one's 24 feet long.
That's pretty smart.
And we've got all the sets and all the costumes, and we have a lot of stock footage we shot for the movie that we didn't use, and you get all that for free. And we will live within your budget. And the budget was horrible. It was $120,000 an episode.
Whoa.
And he made it. But also the networks didn't know if there was an audience out there that would watch these things. Outer Limits hadn't done very well in the ratings, and it just got canceled. Matter of fact, Voyage Beyond the Sea took over its time slot. And Twilight Zone was never a hit in the ratings on the network for its 5-6 year run. They had it on Friday nights, and the only reason CBS kept it on is because Rod Serling would win Emmys for his script, so it was kind of a prestigious show for them in that respect, but it wasn't a big moneymaker. So the network was very concerned about it, but they put Voyage Beyond the Sea on Monday nights, and it immediately was winning its time slot. It was killing CBS, killing NBC, and he was keeping it on budget, on schedule, for the most part. He was delivering things just like with Lost in Space and Star Trek the day before it was supposed to air. He had to shoot a couple episodes simultaneously a couple times to make it work, so Captain Crane would be in this one and Admiral Nelson would be in the other one, and they'd split the crews and everything else to try to get these done and get caught up. And but it was a hit. And CBS said, well, let's get one of those. So Irwin went in and pitched the idea of Swiss Family Robinson in outer space to CBS. They loved it. They put it in development, and that got us to No Place to Hide. And the reason it's called No Place to Hide, and then I'll shut up and let you speak. I just want to get all this out. The reason it's called No Place to Hide is because the network specifically said, we don't want to start at the beginning of the story. We want the pilot to be what an average episode would be. So show us what's going to be happening to these people, maybe episode 12 or episode 13. So he wrote it to be that purpose, where they're marooned on this planet and all these things are happening. But for the purpose of selling the series, he shot some shorter pieces to go in the front that would kind of give us the backstory of how they got into that situation. And so all that stuff only lasts for about 5, maybe even 10 minutes on the screen, and the remainder of the hour, it's about an 80-minute pilot, the remainder of the hour is what would be a typical hour episode of the show, as he saw it. So that's what the pilot was intended to be. And you can see that pilot now on the Blu-ray set for the Lost in Space series, which has just been released. You can watch the original pilot.
Well, where I watched the original pilot was from the digital version released by FHE Fox TV Productions, both on Google Play and YouTube. And the run is about an hour long instead of 80 minutes. I'm not sure if stuff was cut here and there for that.
Yeah, I think the one on the Blu-ray set is longer. And it's probably not 80 minutes. It's probably more like, I think it may be 64, 65 minutes. But if you put commercials in there and everything else, if you were to air it on the network, which a lot of times they would do with pilots, if the pilots didn't sell, if they weren't going to go to series, to recoup their money during the summer months, they would put it on as a TV movie. And so this could have been a 90-minute time slot TV movie. Now, and remember, an hour-long episode is only 50 minutes long, because it's got 10 minutes of commercials in there. Now more, but back then it was 10 minutes. So this was longer than what would be a standard episode. And he had to do it that way because the stuff that led in with the takeoff and them in space briefly and everything else, which lasted maybe 10 minutes at the most on the screen, and maybe as short as 5 minutes, that is not really considered part of what the network wanted to see, but he wanted to put that in there to show what the backstory of it all was. So what they wanted was a solid 50 minutes of a typical Lost in Space episode, and that's the main point of what the pilot is after they get crash land on the planet. You go then 50 minutes from there.
Well, they certainly delivered. My impressions of that pilot piece, I was pretty impressed. This is a 53-year-old series now.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, it premiered. Well, the pilot was made in late '64. They started shooting it in December of '64 and wrapped at the end of January. It took about 6 weeks, and then it took a few months, of course, to get it edited and put in the optical effects and then score it with Johnny Williams, who now is John Williams, the great composer of movies, and he was very young back then and went under the name of Johnny, and get it all ready. And I think it was in March, maybe April, when they screened it for CBS of 1965. CBS ordered the series, and it went on in September of '65. But it got totally it got an overhaul because, as you know, and if anybody listening has seen it, Dr. Smith and the robot are not in the pilot. It's just the Robinson family and their pilot Don West, which is all the same cast members that were in the series, but no Jonathan Harris and no Bob May inside a robot outfit.
It certainly is different from the Lost in Space people might be familiar with, and even the Lost in Space remake that was, what was that, made in '98?
Yeah, late '90s. Mm-hmm.
And a new series is coming out on Netflix, I think this year.
And in between those two, they did a couple pilots to try to get the series back on the air.
Right.
One with the original cast, including Jonathan Harris. Now, that didn't get filmed, but it was written, and everybody was signed up, and they were literally weeks away from pulling trigger on that when Jonathan Harris died unexpectedly, because he was in good health for his age, but he had a blood clot. And I believe in his leg, and he had to go into the hospital, and it was a minor surgery, but he got an infection, and he passed away. And they were meeting with him in his hotel room. He even had a copy of the script in his lap, which he was rewriting, as Jonathan Harris always did. He would rewrite his own part. And so they were very close to filming a pilot with the original cast in the '90s, right around the time they were doing the big screen movie. Right after that, like the year or two after that. And when they realized there wasn't going to be a second big screen movie, that's when they said, well, let's get it back on TV and let's do it with the original cast.
Yeah, the movie
bring in new members, new cast members who are going to find them, out searching for them, and we're going to bring them, and they get marooned. And so now we've got the original people, we've got the new people, and everything else. And that almost got made. But when he passed away, they chucked the script, and they came, and that was going to be for CBS, by the way. And they chucked it, and then they made a new pilot for NBC with a different cast, and that was actually filmed, and you can watch parts of it, or maybe all of it, on YouTube.
I'll certainly look that up later. But back to No Place to Hide. As I said, for its day, it's a remarkable feat of television. I'm actually surprised that it's a television feature. It looks more like something I'd see on the big screen.
It was the most expensive pilot ever made up until that point. The one that was the most expensive prior to it, can you guess?
Most expensive pilot prior to Lost in Space? Was it Journey to the Bottom of the Sea? Or Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea?
Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. Yeah, 1 year earlier. Again, Irwin Allen. Because that's why the networks didn't think a show like this could work on TV, because it was so expensive to make. And the Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea pilot cost over $400,000, which today is nothing. But remember, we've gone through inflation.
Yeah.
And so $1 now, it takes $10 to make up what $1 was back then. So that would be like a $4 million pilot, which, again, they do now. But back then, TV did not spend anywhere near that much money on episodic shows. So $4 million, about $450 million was huge. Well, a year later, he makes Space Family Robinson for CBS, and it's $550 million. And at the same time, over at Desilu, they're making the Star Trek pilot for Paramount, for NBC, and it tops $600 million. So it became the most expensive after that. But when they did Lost in Space, it even topped what Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea had cost and became the most expensive pilot made up to that time. So it's a big production, and too much. They couldn't have kept up that standard. They couldn't have done that every week, because when the show got bought, CBS gave them a budget of $135,000 an episode for Lost in Space, which was more than ABC was paying for Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. But they knew they needed a little more money because of the optical effects that would be used when the ship was in space and things of that nature. and all futuristic costumes and more monsters than you were seeing on Voyage at that time, and which all cost money. So
not to mention live animals.
Yeah, well, they did. They had in the pilot ostriches and futuristic turtles, which was a mechanical turtle, by the way. That thing Penny was riding was a mechanical turtle. It moved and crawled. And giant cyclops and jet packs, which were real. These were a real jet pack where they brought test pilots out there to the Red Rocks area where they were filming that, and he could go up in the air for about 30 seconds at a time, and so they would get a guy, they would make it look like it was Guy Williams flying, and then they would use Guy Williams in front of a blue screen and do the close-ups of him and cut.
We're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, but no, that's in the pilot. That's all in there.
It is. But I wanted to talk about the episode kind of scene by scene.
Okay.
So when it opens up, you see it's not set. It doesn't say NASA. NASA was around at that point, right?
Yeah, it was, but it's just the Air Force, I believe. That was running the program and Alpha Control.
Okay.
And by the way, in the pilot, as you know, it wasn't the Jupiter 2; it was the Gemini 12.
That's right. It had a very different theme in the original pilot, where as the TV announcer is talking about what's going on, giving all the exposition, the camera pans around the control center. You see a whole bank of people translating, and of course everyone working around futuristic at the time terminals. And I got the impression that this was more of a international effort than was seen in the original show.
Yeah, and that footage did actually get into the first episode that was aired on CBS, which was called The Reluctant Stowaway. And they used some of that footage from the pilot in the first 5 or 6 episodes of the series, some of the big centerpiece scenes, the Cyclops and things like that, although they had to film additional Cyclops stuff when they did the episode for the series. But yeah, it showed people from all around the world, and the reason they were sending the mission into space is because Earth had become so overpopulated by the year 1997, was it?
Yes,
I think. And so, fortunately, we haven't weren't that bad in 1997. We're kind of getting there, though. And so they had to figure out how to colonize outer space, which is, of course, an expensive way to send people off from here. But that was the solution they came up with. And so that's how it all got launched. And yeah, you had international people. You had people from every different country there covering this thing. And it's a very impressive shot of the camera dollying past all these people at this long table, each speaking in a different language into a microphone to broadcast this thing to their countries of what's happening.
And that was before the Steadicam.
Yep, you had to lay down track. And so the camera is literally dolly track. The camera is on a track, and it moves very smoothly across there. It's really an immense production. Nobody had seen anything like this being made for television before. And you look at those. You look at the Gemini 12, which is a little bit different than the Jupiter 2 because it's one level, where the Jupiter 2 was 2. So they had to actually remake the model when they did the series to make it look bigger, so it could have 2 floors in it, plus the third lower section, which was a smaller section, which would be the nuclear reactor. And but this was a one-level spaceship because there were no sleeping areas in the ship because everybody slept in the freezing tubes. And so you see the ship take off, but it doesn't get sabotaged like it does in the series. There's no Dr. Smith who's working for some foreign power, which they never said, but we all assumed it was Russia. And he's American. He's an American Air Force officer, doctor, and a specialist in those freezing tubes and things of that nature, which is why he was assigned to this mission. But in the pilot, we don't have that. The reason they end up marooned on a planet is because the ship hits a meteor storm and gets damaged, and they lose control and they crash on the planet while everybody's still in the freezing tubes. Everybody.
Yep.
So after the crash, and one of the tubes leaks, and I think it's Major West who gets out. he revives everybody else, and they've realized that they're on this planet. Now they have to learn how to survive while they try to fix the ship, just like the Swiss Family Robinson had to in the Disney movie.
It's a very remarkable bit of special effects. I mean, first you go from this massive Alpha Control Center, which was a huge set, and as we mentioned, they had to lay down all that track for the camera to move smoothly across the room, the interpreters, and everything else. The president comes on, gives his speech, and then we see the takeoff, and all the while, the announcer is giving narration to what's going on, and the liftoff and everything else. From a modern look, from a retrospective, it looks kind of cheesy, but for what was produced in that day, it was actually fairly surprising how they...
Oh, state of the art.
Yes.
State of the art. You're not going to see anything that's that good. Maybe Forbidden Planet, the spaceship in Forbidden Planet, which was a big budget movie that had come out a few years earlier. The Day the Earth Stood Still. A few things like that. There had been a couple very big science fiction movies, This Island Earth, which had good production value and good spaceships and good optical effects and things of that nature. But this was right up there with the best of them.
It didn't look like just a saucer hanging on a string.
Yeah, no, it looked really good. Of course, it was hanging on a string, but we didn't see that. And the takeoff, I mean, when the Gemini 12 takes off from Earth, that is just a fabulous shot. The meteor storm is a remarkable
I was
shot.
very, very impressed with the meteor storm. How
Nobody
the rocks just
that.
bounced off. That all practical effects too. I mean, it didn't look too fake.
Yeah, and then
obvious.
after they crash land, I mean, there's so many sequences that Irwin Allen, and he directed this pilot. He co-wrote it with Shimon Winselberg, who went on to write several episodes of Lost in Space, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, Star Trek. Was a very well-respected playwright and television writer who wrote for the big anthology series like Studio One, and he had a couple plays running on Broadway. So it was top-drawer talent all the way around. And look at the cast. Let's talk about that, because we're starting kind of going from the beginning. Irwin Allen, later on, would do movies like The Poseidon Adventure and Towering Inferno, and he would bring in just amazing cast. Towering Inferno, look, you got Steve McQueen and Paul Newman and William Holden and Fred Astaire and all these people in one movie. Same thing with Poseidon Adventure. They had 4 Academy Award-winning actors in this one movie, and great effects. And that's what Irwin was known for. And he had been doing this in his movies, the Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea movie, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, The Lost World. They were big casts and big effects. So he brought this into television. He made it an all-star cast. And in the books that I've written on this, on Lost in Space, it's a 3-book series, one for each season.
Oh, it did end up 3 books?
Yes, just like I did for Star Trek. They're all out now, by the way. The 3rd one came out about a month ago. And
when we talked previously, you had just finished. You had submitted your 2nd book, I believe.
Yeah, no, they're all done, and because I write them all at the same time. We don't put the first one out. Same thing with the These Are the Voyages series on the first Star Trek. I would write them all 3, and then they would publish the first one, and then I'd be rewriting and finessing and finalizing book 2, and that would come out, and then book 3 would come out. But the first drafts would all be written before we'd put the first one out, because you got to know how the story ends.
Yeah.
As a writer, you got to get through the whole process before you can put out the first third of the movie. You got to know what the rest of the movie is.
Well, congratulations on having
so they're all
those 3
out now. Yeah, and so in the first book, we cover Irwin Allen's early career, which nobody's ever done before, and I had access to the Irwin Allen private papers, and then we cover the entire, the making of the pilot and the entire first broadcast season of Lost in Space, which is the fans' favorite, because it was more serious. It was black and white. It was kind of film noirish, and it didn't start getting cute until towards the end. And I have no problem with the funny episodes that came later, the comedy episodes in the colored part of the series, but I think we all like that first season the best. And in reading the books, you find out why those changes were made. You find out who was behind that and what the situation was. But yeah, he made this giant pilot, and it was an all-star cast. So you have Guy Williams, who came from Zorro.
Yeah.
So he's a big star on TV. Zorro was an immense hit. And the only reason Zorro went off is because Disney changed its affiliation from ABC to NBC, because NBC was in color and ABC wasn't back then, and he wanted his Walt Disney show to be in color. It had been on ABC for several years already, and so was Zorro, and so was the Mickey Mouse Club, and all these other things that Disney was producing. But he wanted color, and ABC wasn't ready to start broadcasting color, so he got out of his contract and he moved everything over to NBC, except for the Mickey Mouse Club and Zorro, because ABC refused to let go of those. So they took them out of production. ABC said, you're not taking those over to NBC. So they had to stop making them, even though Zorro was in the top 10 of the ratings, and it was just a show that everybody was watching. Kids were hooked on it. So Guy Williams is a big star, and suddenly he doesn't have a series. So Irwin Allen grabbed him. June Lockhart had just finished 6 years on Lassie, which was an immense hit.
Oh,
and then they decided to change the format of Lassie because the boy had grown up. So they had to kind of like move to a different family, and so the Millers were taken out. So now June Lockhart's available. Angela Cartwright had just finished 7 years on Make Room for Daddy, the Danny Thomas Show. And it was a hit, but Danny Thomas was tired of doing the show. He'd been doing it for more than 7 years because they had a couple years before she was in the show. And so he needed a break. So she's suddenly available, and she just finished Sound of Music. Marc Goddard, which a lot of people don't know, but it's in the book, you'll find out, had 3 TV series before Lost in Space. He was a well-respected TV star. He had been in a Western called Johnny Ringo, then he had been in The Detectives with Robert Taylor, and then he had been in a sitcom with Eleanor Donahue, who was on Father Knows Best prior, and Many Happy Returns, I think it was called. That one didn't last very long. That just went one season. And but he was well-respected. He had just come off that show the previous year. And who are we forgetting? Marta Kristen. Marta Kristen had just done a movie for Disney in the lead, and she was being seen in a lot of TV episodes as a guest star. She was doing a lot of commercials and print ads and everything. So all of these people, and Bill Mumy. My God, everybody knew Bill Mumy. He worked more than any kid in television. And you remember him in Twilight Zone.
Voice.
Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents and all these things. He had just done a film with Jimmy Stewart and Brigitte Bardot called Dear Bridget, where he was the lead. He was the protagonist in the movie, as a little boy who writes a love letter to Brigitte Bardot and everything. So this is an all-star cast with the best special effects that could be done from one of the biggest studios in Hollywood, who had these amazing technicians under contract and everything else. So that's why that pilot looks so good. And it still boggles the mind and boggles the eye, even today when you look at it. You may say some of the stuff feels a little cheesy because we've evolved, but really it's not bad. And I got to tell you, Ross, it's like I can watch that show and I can watch Voyage Bomb Sea, I can watch the original Star Trek. I think they look better than a lot of what we're seeing now, which is CGI, because these are real miniatures. A 24-foot-long Seaview, a 12-foot-long Enterprise. I mean, these are immense miniatures filmed against a blue screen, and they feel real. When the Enterprise passes the camera, it feels like it's a real thing because it was. Now when you see it pass by, it feels like it's animation, because it is.
There's definitely something to be said about practical effects and their effectiveness on how you see them on screen, and it definitely shows in these old shows and in this pilot. As we go from the crash of the Gemini to the ground scenes, where you first see the camp after the crash, after everyone's been after they've been there for at least 6 months, and the first thing you see is a journal done by
Professor Robinson,
Professor Robinson, written in hand.
Because if you watch Disney's version of Swiss Family Robinson, that's how it is. And by the way, just like in Swiss Family Robinson, you've got the first 10 minutes of the movie is on the ship, and they hit a storm, and now you see the ship shipwrecked on the rocks on this island, which looked just gorgeous, and it was a big miniature. And then the Robinson character, they were the Robinsons, the father, is keeping a journal and handwriting a journal, and his voiceover kind of walks us through the story.
Right.
Which, by the way, again, to put Lost in Space in its proper place and give it credit, what does this feel like when you're hearing Guy Williams' voice narrating the episode from his journal logs? What came along a year later that used the same technique?
I'm not sure. What was it?
Captain's Log. Star Trek. You got William Shatner's voice walking you into every episode. Captain's Log, Stardate, blah blah blah. The Enterprise is orbiting this planet. So I mean, Gene Roddenberry really got a lot of his ideas from Lost in Space. He got ideas of how he didn't want Star Trek to be, but he got a lot of ideas of what Star Trek could be from watching Lost in Space.
Oh,
and it's really funny going through the show files and going through the private Irwin Allen papers and going through the private Gene Roddenberry papers, as I've been privileged to do for these book shows, for these book series that I've written on these shows, is Gene kept a file on Irwin, and Irwin kept a file on Gene, because their shows are on simultaneously on different networks, and they were competing. I mean, Irwin kept the ratings, not just for his shows, but for Star Trek. He didn't just clip out clippings on his shows, he clipped out reviews and clippings on Star Trek. And the same thing was happening over on the Star Trek camp. They were all very, very interested to see what the competitor was doing and how the ratings were comparing and how the reviews were comparing. So it's really kind of fun to dig through all that stuff, and we put it all in the books so you can see it without having to go through these private archives, which you probably couldn't do anyway. And you see this competition, and you see them watching each other, and you see them mentioning each other in their memos. You know? Very interesting.
So back to No Place
the pilot. Well, I'm going to do that. I can't, and you know, and we should, because as we're talking about this pilot, we have to tell how it's different from the series.
Of course.
So, and the Star Trek pilot's being shot at the same time as the Lost in Space pilot. They were both shot. I think they started within a few days of each other.
Interesting.
And they were not far apart. I mean, Lost in Space pilot's being filmed at 20th Century Fox in West LA, and the Star Trek pilot was being filmed at Desilu's Culver City studio, not their Hollywood one where the series was done, but the Culver City studio that they owned, and which were formerly part of RKO, which Desilu took over. And they're only a couple miles apart. Matter of fact, a lot of people would ride bicycles in between the two lots. They're so close together.
Then how
so
is
just
that Lost in Space's pilots and its first several seasons are in black and white, but Star Trek started in color?
Because Star Trek was on NBC.
Oh, that's right. And you mentioned that NBC had already made the transition, but CBS
NBC was the first network to do color, and they were the first network to go all color. CBS was second, ABC was third. So by 1967, all three networks were broadcasting everything in color. But in 64, the first season of Voyage to Bomb Sea is black and white, and in 65, the first season of Lost in Space is in black and white, because the real big change didn't happen until about 66. And that's when Star Trek premiered. But the pilots were filmed in color anyway, because they knew the show would have to be in color if it was going to go on, because it was for NBC. By the way, in reading the book, you'll see that in that big chapter on the pilot and the creation of the series and everything, they thought about doing it in color, but they realized that if CBS picked up the show, it was going to be in black and white, and so why spend the extra money to do it in color? And so, you know, Irwin in the studio was considering it, because they were thinking, look, we're going to be shooting stuff that maybe we can use in later episodes, and so maybe we should do it in color, but the added cost was just too much. But what Irwin did do when he shot the pilot is he did do the stuff out at the Pinnacles and Red Rock and everything where that looked like an alien planet, where they went out and filmed that stuff, which was right on the border of California and Nevada, and in the desert out there, and these strange rock formations and everything. So they went out and shot there. They shot that footage in color. the Cyclops, everything else. So in later seasons of Lost in Space, second and third season, occasionally you see a shot snuck in from the pilot, and it's in color, and you can see the Cyclops in color, and you can see the chariot driving through those areas in color, because they did use color photography just for that, and that alone.
So we keep mentioning the Cyclops, so let's get into that. The family's been stranded on this planet for about 6 months at this point. They've started a small garden to feed themselves. They've domesticated a couple animals. We mentioned the ostrich, which is all done up with I guess you could call them spines or antenna to make it look like an alien ostrich. You've got
the reason there's an ostrich is because they had ostriches in Swiss Family Robinson.
You've got
it looks very much like that movie. Irwin was patterning that entire pilot, which was brilliant of him. You know, that's high concept. That's what we do in TV. Is you come in and say, what if Swiss Family Robinson is married to Forbidden Planet? You know, it's like you take two different genres and you put them together. So he was, and interesting enough, and again, it's in the book, is when he first did his deal with CBS, it was supposed to be a series based on Swiss Family Robinson, not a science fiction. You know, he went there and he pitched the idea of doing Swiss Family Robinson to them, and you see the memos in the book there. And then Voyage is doing so well at that point. It had just gone on the air a few weeks earlier, but now we're maybe a month or two into it as they're developing this thing. And that's when they thought, no, let's make it science fiction. So then he said, okay, Space Family Robinson. And they went with that.
And it's something you won't see in television anymore due to the way the rules have changed about using live animals in production.
Yeah, and the reason those ostriches didn't carry over into the series, and the quotes in the book, Bill Mooney told me, he said he hated those ostriches. He was scared to death of them. They would spit at him. They would peck at him. There's a scene in the pilot where you see him chasing the ostriches, and he was scared to death to do it because they were vicious little creatures.
Yeah.
Well, not so little. Big creatures.
Yeah.
They were as big as he was.
Bigger than he was.
Yeah, and he couldn't stand it. So they just, let's come up with the bloop instead.
And you only really see it for that one scene in the beginning where he's chasing after him, yelling at it to come back.
Right.
And there are other animals in the pilot, too. You mentioned the mechanical
turtle.
Yeah,
you see him in a little pen. You see some, like, llamas or some kind of strange, furry, cattle-like creatures in a pen. So, yeah, they've found animals on this planet that they're using.
And like then there's the chimpanzee with the headdress on. Yep,
Debbie. Isn't that a fun picture in the book where Debbie doing her screen test? You see the monkey standing there with this board right next to her that's giving the date and screen test and everything, and they're shooting the monkey to see how it looks with this headdress on and the whole thing, which was the same chimpanzee that was in Daktari at the same time that they were doing Lost in Space. In Daktari, they called it Judy, but Debbie was the chimp's real name. And so Debbie had 2 TV series in prime time on CBS running simultaneously.
Impressive.
And that's why, by the way, and I know we're getting off the pilot again, but again, it's relative. That's why we don't see Debbie in every episode of Lost in Space, and for a while it seems like she's been lost in Lost in Space because they needed her in every episode of Daktari.
Now she's a smart chimp. I'm sure she can take care of herself.
Busy chimpanzee.
Well, I'm sure it's a smart enough chimp. She can take care of herself when she's not on camera.
Very smart. They all love Debbie, except Jonathan Harris. But Jonathan Harris kind of liked her. He liked to complain about her, but you could tell he liked her. Get that chimp away from me! I'm not picking up that thing. It'll bite me.
So amidst this wonderful scene of a family that's taken a bad situation and turned it around and made it livable and pleasant, even it's a very hopeful scene among what you would see in a lot of sci-fi at the time, which is a lot darker, and even sci-fi today it tends more towards the darker, pessimistic side. So it's nice. Well,
that was the problem with the Lost in Space movie by New Line is you just didn't like these characters. I mean, in the original series, you even liked Dr. Smith. He was a villain, but you liked him. There was something about him that you liked, even before he got kind of comical. But you watch the movie, the big screen movie, and they're it's a dysfunctional family, and the Dr. Smith character is so evil. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have any good qualities at all.
He's not even human by the end of it.
Yeah, you just want him to die, which he does. But no, that was a great moment in the show, and the passages being written by John Robinson really brought forward that Swiss Family Robinson flavor and the family together and everything else, which is one of the reasons why I think us big kids still love this show. You know, because it's when we were watching it, when we were little kids watching this show, if we were as 8, 9, 10-year-old kids going to be put into outer space, which we all would love to have done, you'd want to go with your family, you know, because your family is your thing, your safe place at that age, and so that's part of the magic of it, is putting a family together in this crazy.
Thank you for watching Getting Lost in Space. Mark and I still have so much more to say about the pilot episode, so I'm breaking up the discussion into multiple parts in an effort to make it more digestible, as well as an attempt to preserve what sanity I have left. For more information about Mark's 3-part biography on Lost in Space, visit jacobsbrownmediagroup.com or look for it in a bookstore near you. Do you have any memories of Lost in Space? What are your thoughts or impressions on the pilot so far? Are you going to watch No Place to Hide for yourself? Let me know in the comments below, and we'll start a conversation. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. You can watch this video and others like it first on Patreon. Thank you once again for watching, and until next time, remember to live, to love, and to play every day.
In association with Busy Little Beaver Productions.